The terrifying last minutes of ultramarathon runners. Gansu Ultramarathon. Labeled as the deadliest sporting disaster in China, 21 runners died when extreme weather turned what should have been an average day of running into one of the worst nightmares the world has ever seen. No fewer than 21 out of 172 participants would lose their lives battling severe hypothermia and gusts of wind that reached the speed of 55 miles per hour. But what exactly went wrong? And is there any way that this could have been avoided? Or perhaps there might have been some nefarious intentions involved. This is the story of the Gansu Marathon and how 21 of the world's best athletes ultimately lost their lives due to miscalculation and natural elements. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Gansu Marathon. The Gansu Marathon is one of the biggest marathon events held in the world, and it attracts some of the best athletes. For the 2021 edition, it was held in the Yellow River Stone Forest in Jingtai Country, Gansu, China. Organized by the Sports Department of Baiyin Prefecture Level City and Communist Party Committee, the race has been around since 2018. For the 2021 edition, it was decided that the event would consist of no fewer than 3 events. The first would be a short 3.1-mile run. The second would be a half marathon, and the finale was a 62-mile ultra marathon through the forest. But not everyone was entitled to simply run this event, and the organizers understood that they only wanted professional athletes to compete. So this meant that participants in the ultramarathon even had to show proof of having completed a race over 20 miles in the past year. As another precaution, the race organizers recommended windbreakers for the runners, but this was never made a compulsory rule, something that would later haunt the officials looking back. As with any professional marathon, riders had numerous officials at checkpoints to ensure that everyone was safe, and the goal was to simply have a fun event that everyone could enjoy. But the elite runners in the world would obviously go for the win. Unfortunately, this was not to be the case, and just 2,230 meters into the race, the worst-case scenario happened, and this would turn into one of the worst disasters the world had ever seen, even surpassing the fatality rate of the US-China Yangtze rafting disaster that happened in 1986. Chapter 2. The Race Planning. Set along the Mijiaishan Hill of the Yellow River Stone Forest, the 62-mile trail ran across a treeless karst terrain at the transition from the lowest plateau at its south all the way to the Tengger Desert at the north. For the terrain, it would mostly be sandstone that the runners would run on from the starting line, which stood at 5.233 feet above sea level. The highest point of the race would be 7,320 feet at the third checkpoint, and the run from the second checkpoint to this third one would also have the narrowest roads on the trail. Unfortunately, these paths were not accessible by car, and the nearest hike from a main route would take anywhere from 1 to 2 hours to reach the area in the best of conditions. Another major flaw in the coordination of the race was the fact that no staff were assigned to the second and third checkpoints, and the race organizer also didn't know that these 2 checkpoints would also be mobile signal blind spots. This meant that for the time the runners were at these checkpoints, they would have no way of communicating with the outside world. But even the night before the race, there were no signs of what was about to happen, and according to all reports, the weather was described as being quite pleasant. Looking back at the previous iterations of the race, the organizers had nothing to stress about, as the previous iterations were all sunny and hot, with dehydration being the biggest issue. But race organizers should have kept an eye on the weather updates that were coming in from the city's meteorological center, which issues the lowest grade of a 4-graded wind warning. Here is what the center had to say. In the upcoming 24 hours, Beihin Jingtai, the average wind speed will reach levels 5 to 6 and gusts will reach level 7 or above, accompanied by yellow dust and sand. In fact, it is said that at an unknown time before the race, the same center already warned of dust and sand carried by winds and a massive drop in temperature with some precipitation in the area. Here is the statement. 21st to 22nd May is forecasted to have massive yellow dust and sand carried by winds, a drop in temperature and some precipitation. Atmospheric convection is getting strong in many in general, so beware of sudden heavy showers, hail, lightning, and gusts. This should have naturally been seen as a massive warning, but communication between the weather center and the race organizers didn't seem to work as well as it had in previous years. For the 3 previous iterations, they even perfectly planned for the hot weather conditions and strategically planned their aid stations in order for those suffering from possible dehydration. But on the evening of May 21st, 2021, many of the runners handed their windbreakers to officials who would move all the gear of the participants to the 6th checkpoint of the race. Here they would be able to pick them up and move on to the end of the race. Unfortunately, this was the last thing that many of the runners would remember, and what happened the following day on May 22nd would not only shock Chinese officials, but the world as a whole, and it would send shockwaves through the athletics community. Chapter 3. The terrifying death of 21 runners. The race began at 9 a.m. nationwide Beijing time on Saturday, May 22nd, 2021. With the weather still being normal, no one suspected anything would happen. But just 1 hour and 30 minutes into the run, ultimate tragedy would strike as the 3rd checkpoint was hit by a cold front, which originated from Mongolia via the Tenga Desert of Jingtai. Measured from 8 a.m., the temperature dropped from around 5 to 7 degrees Celsius within 5 hours. But this was not the biggest issue. According to some of the survivors, it was the gales accompanied by gropel and rain, which was the bigger issue. And the average wind speeds reached between levels 6 and 7. Gusts are said to have reached levels 8 to 9, and these winds carried precipitation of between 3 and 5 millimeters. According to race organizers, the temperatures felt by the runners at around 9:20 at the 1st and 2nd checkpoints would be 7 degrees Celsius or 45 degrees Fahrenheit. But it is the instant drop in the temperature that would ultimately cause the biggest issues. Just 1 hour and 30 minutes later, the temperature was around 3 degrees Celsius or 37 degrees Fahrenheit. But what many forget to note is the fact that as elevation increases, the temperature becomes significantly colder. With an elevation of 7,320 feet, the temperature at the 3rd checkpoint was already around -5 degrees Celsius at 11 a.m. What happened next can only be described as horrifying. Liang Jing, one of China's champion marathon runners, was one of the best runners and a favorite for winning. By the time he had reached the 3rd checkpoint, about 12 miles into the race, fierce winds were pelting frozen bits of ice in a sideways manner, and freezing rain belted down on the runners. Realizing this, many runners would try to shield themselves by hiding behind boulders, and Liang was one of those fortunate enough to notice a cave along with 3 other runners. But he was one of the unfortunate victims who didn't make it by the time rescuers would finally arrive on the scene. As the storm battered the checkpoint, a distress call sounded from the remote site. But thanks to a lack of signal and some other undisclosed communication failures, the message was left unanswered for a staggering 45 minutes. To put this into perspective, 6 hours would pass before the gravity of the situation finally reached the emergency coordinators. During this time, the cold weather would lead to severe hypothermia that set in for many of the runners, which is when the body loses heat faster than it can produce it. During hypothermia, the body redirects all the heat in the outer extremities to the organs, which means that runners lose control of their feet, legs, hands, and arms. This made it almost impossible for them to protect themselves, as many would slip into a state of unconsciousness before the body ultimately shut down and they faded away. Along with the loss of coordination and shivering, hypothermia also affects the brain, causing confusion, which ultimately made navigation that much harder once amnesia and hallucinations set in. Many victims were rendered incapable of self-rescue, but rescue itself was still about 6 hours away. Ventricular fibrillation, which ultimately leads to cardiac arrest, would be the cause of death for many of these unfortunate victims. Ultimately, 21 runners would lose their lives during this horrific ordeal, and when the rescue attempts finally began, it was simply a game of reaching the victims before the natural cooling effect of the body kicked in and runners died. However, a couple of heroes would emerge from this ordeal and save the lives of some of the lost runners. Chapter 4. The Heroes. A lonely shepherd by the name of Zhu Keiming, who had spent his life herding sheep and living in a cave home on the mountainside, was one of the most unlikely heroes. Noticing many of the runners had lost their way and became disoriented, he ushered 6 runners into the warmth of his shelter. Thanks to his bravery in actively searching for some of the runners, the Hummel Cave would save the lives of many disoriented athletes. Another man by the name of Zhu Wanwen, who had a motorbike, would set off on his bike at around 4 o'clock, where he ran into a foaming runner around 6 or 7 p.m. He would also save one of the runners before he had to stop his search due to the unwavering conditions. By the time the firefighters had arrived at the scene, it was already dark, and many described the ordeal as a scene from a horror movie with bodies scattered across miles of rugged terrain. These firefighters would ultimately be responsible for the recovery process of the deceased, who would later have the answer to questions of why specialized rescue teams were not on the scene. Chapter 5. The Errors in Rescue. One of the things many people didn't know is that the main operator of the race actually equipped runners with GPS devices. According to local reports, the first distress call was already sent at around 11:50 a.m. by one of the runners via his GPS device. Unfortunately, this runner would not receive any response. Another distress signal was sent via the official WeChat messaging group at around 12:17 p.m., followed by another photo of 10 runners hugging at 12:30 p.m. Upon receiving this, the specialized rescue team by the name of Blue Sky Rescue would send some of the 39 rescuers it had stationed at the starting line into the nearby hills between the second and third checkpoint. This ill-equipped rescue team would lead a group of 18 runners out of the mountains and to a lodge at the foothill. At around 2:30, the owners of the area, the Yellow River Stone Forest Administration, also phoned the mayor of Zhongquan Town, suggesting that winter supplies be brought to the runners, but this was delegated to the closest village, which would be Changsburg Village at the foothill of the area. Unfortunately, villagers who were eager to help would only receive information of the urgency more than 2 hours later at 4:42. But what is extremely disturbing is that once the firefighters reached the area around 9 hours later, many of them had not been trained or geared for dealing with or even identifying hypothermia. This meant that the firefighters never even attempted to perform CPR on some of the runners, who they would describe as looked dead. This could have potentially halved the deaths on this faithful day, and many others might have survived. But what happened in the aftermath of this horrific accident? Chapter 6. The Aftermath. With the blame solely on the square of the event organizers, one man by the name of Li Zuobi, who was Jingtai country's Communist Party secretary, would commit suicide on June 9th of the same year. Disciplinary action was to be taken against 31 others, with most of the punishment coming in the form of demerit. Unfortunately, this was not enough for the general public, and the situation generated incredible anger in the public, with the blame directed at the organizers and the local government. This outcry would eventually reach international headlines, creating one of the grimmest pictures of sporting events in the People's Republic of China and causing large international outcry and hatred. Thanks to this, the Sports Administration of China would go on to suspend all high-risk sporting events that lack oversight bodies. Numerous trail running events, wingsuit flying, and ultra-long-distance races were to be cancelled for the foreseeable future until the governing bodies were created to ensure the safety of the athletes. 2 years later, in 2023, many of those who lost their lives in this race would finally get a sense of justice for their families. According to reports from news sources in China, 5 of the organizers of the race would receive jail terms, which ranged from 3 to 5.5 years behind bars. The 5 defendants were convicted for organizing a large-scale event that led to a significant safety incident. But this is not the first time athletes have lost their lives during such intense marathon races with inadequate organization and fatal errors. Chapter 7. Is long-distance marathon running safe? One of the most notable ultramarathons is the infamous Marathon des Sables, or MDS, which means the Marathon of the Sands, more commonly referred to as the Sahara Marathon. This incredible race is the ultimate test of endurance for runners, and it covers the distance of approximately 6 regular marathons at a distance of 160 miles or 257 kilometers. By all accounts, the race should be one for concern, as one of the longest stages during the 7-day competition forces runners to complete a distance of 57 miles in a single day, before having rest and running approximately the same distance the next day. The massive race is held each year in the south of Morocco, and runners need to endure the unforgiving conditions of the Sahara Desert. It is often described as the toughest foot race on Earth and has been annually held since 1986. To this day, very few incidents have ever occurred during this event, with one of the only known incidents being that of a French runner who was in his early 50s in 2021 who suffered cardiac arrest during the event, which later resulted in his death. With a big emphasis on runner safety, despite many claiming that it is survival of the fittest, the Moroccan authorities have managed to give runners a safe environment each and every year, something that did not happen in China. With numerous contestants and the race featuring more than 1,000 participants, it is perhaps one of the best places for people to fully learn and understand what it takes to hold some of these competitions. This means that when held under the right conditions and being fully prepared for what could happen, you could potentially limit the issues that could arise, something that race organizers on Gansu completely ignored despite weather predictions saying that there is a chance of conditions spiraling out of control. However, it seems like the problem has been rectified by the organizers of such events, and perhaps in the future the Gansu Marathon might be held with adequate resources and safety measures. But this will be something for the future. But what do you think of this massive race, and do you think Chinese authorities are to blame, or should it simply be attributed to a sudden change in weather conditions? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching this video and supporting this channel. We highly appreciate your support, as this is not an AI channel and every video is thoroughly researched to ensure accuracy. Until next time.